So good afternoon. My name is Lucan Wei. I'm a professor of political science at the University of Toronto and co-director of the Petro Yatsik program for the study of Ukraine. 1 week ago, we learned about the tragic death of Alexei Navalny, who's widely considered the leading opponent of Vladimir Putin. His death was very clearly facilitated by the regime. And today we're joined by a group of preeminent experts on Russian politics to discuss Navalny's importance, what his killing tells us about the regime, and the future of Russian opposition. In alphabetical order, first we have our own professor, Brendan McElroy, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science. He studies Russian politics, state formation, political development, and history of representative institutions in Russia and early modern Europe. Next, we have Nikolai Petrov, who's a visiting researcher at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. He's also a consulting fellow at the Chatham Institute, and he's the author or editor of dozens of analyses of Russian politics and post-Soviet transformation. We also have Professor Graham Robertson, who's a professor of political science at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and director of the Center for Slavic, Eurasian, and East European Studies. Graham's latest book with Sam Green is Putin versus the People, that was published by Yale University Press. And this book examines the social bases of support for and opposition to authoritarian rule. He's published in all the top political science journals and is also written on protest and opposition in Russia. He's also, according to one Russian site, been studying the destruction of Russian civil society for 20 years. So that's, I guess, it's happened. So congratulations, Graham.
Next, I think it's 30 by now, but yeah.
It's 30, okay. So yeah, so you still look, yeah, it could be 20. Just say 20. Next, we have Professor Gulnaz Sharafdinova, who's professor at King's College London. She has published an award-winning, a really fantastic book, The Red Mirror, Putin's Leadership and Russia's Insecure Identity, with Oxford, that was published in 2020. This book explores the issues of authoritarian legitimation in Russia after the 2014 Crimean annexation. Her most recent book, she's been incredibly prolific, is The Afterlife of the Soviet Man, Rethinking Homo Sovieticus, published by Bloomsbury in 2023, that presents the intellectual biography of selected writers and thinkers who have contributed to knowledge building on the effects of communism on people living under communism. She speaks Russian, Tatar, and English. Okay, so I'm going to start with you, Kolya. Can you just remind us who Navalny was and why he is such an important figure?
Well, Navalny was the brightest person in Russian political opposition and the one who had the biggest crowd of fans and followers, especially among young generation. He used to start as a blogger. Well, he's unique in a sense that he did manage to become a well-known public politician in absence of public politics in the country. So he did start as a blogger, then he did make a lot of different anti-corruption investigations, and he did end being the most influential person when it went about elections. In 2018 presidential elections, he managed, I think, to benefit more than anybody else, Vladimir Putin included, because he did establish the real political party, represented in almost all regions of Russia, and he became really influential person in Russian opposition, which was recognizable and which was well listened attentively by crowds of Russians. In 2020, he has been poisoned by FSB. He did manage to survive, being transported to Germany, but immediately after his recovery, he came back to Russia. He was arrested there. Last year, he got 19 years in prison, plus to 9 years he got half a year before, and recently he was put into the prison beyond the polar circle in the Malnenes district, where he did die several days ago.
Great. Brendan, can you sort of put Navalny in the context of the Russian opposition over the last 20 or 30 years? I mean, I saw on Facebook or Twitter, one person had a picture of the communist Zyuganov and said, well, this is the real main opposition in Russia. And obviously, Zyuganov was the opposition in 1996, but how has the Russian opposition evolved since
Yeah,
then?
I mean, it's been sort of conventional, I suppose, since the early 2000s and maybe even before, to divide Russian opposition into two camps or two sort of schools of a systemic opposition that, basically works within the system, will engage in sort of focused or limited opposition on certain policy issues. So for the Communist Party and Zyuganov, the pension reform would be an example. And then a more kind of radical non-system opposition that aims at toppling Putin and establishing, or I was going to say reestablishing, but let's say establishing some type of new political order. And so, there's a big difference between Navalny and someone like Zyuganov, not only in terms of ideology, but also in terms of where they would situate themselves with regard to tactics and their attitude toward the regime in general. I will say Navalny was, I guess, both kind of a symbol and a catalyst for changes that have happened in the sort of liberal or non-communist wing of the opposition over the past few decades, in part because of him and in part due to other things that he is a reflection of. The sort of liberal or non-communist wing of the opposition is more sort of populist and less economically liberal in the sense of pro-market, free market, market reform than they were 15 or 20 or 25 years ago, maybe even a little bit more recently. He's someone who, did not shy away from contentious and confrontational tactics, didn't hesitate to call Putin out by name, for instance, but also showed considerable acumen, I would say, for, coalition building and recognizing the fact that any successful anti-Putin coalition is going to be a big tent ideologically. It'll include, liberals, leftists, nationalists, labor, employers. So, it won't really be an ideologically cohesive opposition. It'll be a big tent. So I would say his significance, or one of the ways in which he differed from a lot of other opposition figures, is his ability, even if not without some controversy, to kind of appeal to a bigger, less ideologically narrow camp.
Interesting. So I mean, he obviously emerged at precisely the moment when the Putin's regime was becoming much more closed, and so he faced much more daunting challenges, and I would say, than probably Zyuganov did, certainly in the 1990s when politics was much more open. Gulnaz, can you talk a little bit about how he was able to sort of break through and sort of kind of gain such attention in such a sort of inhospitable environment for political opposition?
Yes, thank you, Lucan. Yeah, I actually want to build, to answer your question and related issues, I want to build on Nikolai's point about how he was really supported and popular among youth in Russia. And I think the distinctiveness of him as a politician, as an anti-corruption fighter, as a protester, is also linked to his, he represented sort of new generations and the future of politics. He was much more dynamic. I think we can see a lot of learning on his path that he did, not shying away from all kinds of ideas and all kinds of pathways and groups, but he was very dynamic. He embraced change, he embraced technology, and so while, say, Zyuganov, Communist Party, LDPR, right, they were very much sort of linked to also the personalities of their leaders, but I don't know, I think it will be a good PhD study to look at the learning that different parties have done or various politicians have done, and from that crowd, in terms of dynamism, openness to change, embracing of new technologies, really Navalny stands out, and that explains why he was so popular among young politicians, and why, because time is not standing still, and why he's such a threat to the establishment that wants to keep things as they are, and therefore is sort of drawing everyone back into the past. So I would, I think these notions of orientedness towards future, dynamism, is something that really distinguishes his personality, his style of leadership, and what makes him strong and what makes him a threat to the system that doesn't want to move ahead.
So maybe Graham, you can just remind us of some of the sort of things he did, and I think in terms of the videos of an estate that I believe he claimed was Putin's estate, or I mean some of the things that sort of drew the attention, I think particularly in the anti-corruption realm, got a lot of attention.
Yeah, I mean, just to build on what people have said so far, that to me the big thing about Navalny is he's really smart and very creative.
Yeah.
And he reached a big audience by producing through his anti-corruption foundation the extraordinary videos that revealed the dramatic wealth of Russia's elite, including Putin himself, and very famously Medvedev, who has been his sidekick for decades. And these videos did a couple of things. One was that they demonstrated the wealth that these people had, but they also showed incredible investigative genius in tracking down the proof of the schemes that generated this wealth and the reality, and really demonstrating the extent to which all of this stuff was directly stealing from Russians on a daily basis. And he talked a lot about the stolen 20 years and these kinds of things. So Navalny, along with his really brilliant team, I mean, the other thing that he was really amazing at is surrounding himself with extraordinary individuals. And even after he was imprisoned, the Navalny YouTube channel continued to be an extraordinary source for all of us, I think, to learn about corruption within the Russian elite. And he was really able to use that to break out into much larger circles. Now, the drawback, I think, if I make it kind of sort of end the hagiography part for just briefly and talk about some of the challenges. The drawback is that he was increasingly pushed into that online sphere. So Navalny and his supporters and sympathizers, of whom there are tens of thousands all across the country, were excluded from the institutions of power. They're excluded from electoral competition. And increasingly in the last few years, they're excluded from the streets. Right, the regime clamped down more and more harshly. Navalny was one of the very few, I think it was Nikolai that mentioned this, was one of the few people who could actually generate a big crowd on the streets. And so he was increasingly pushed into this online space and into sort of the foreign media. And as that happened, it became harder and harder, I think, for him to break through past the large but relatively speaking, constricted circles of people who actually care about corruption. I think he really believed that anti-corruption was the true weapon that was going to destroy the regime. So he came up with this nickname for the ruling party, United Russia, the party of thieves and crooks. And that was, again, brilliant and really captured in a few sentences. But the problem is, I think it's really hard to break through beyond a certain circle, because Russians already know United Russia is the party of thieves and crooks. And so that anti-corruption message, paradoxically, I think sort of limited the reach of what he was able to do. Now, that's not his fault. It's not the organization's fault. It says more about the nature of Russian society, I think. And so in the end of the last few years, what looked like a real hope, the shining light of these incredible investigative pieces, I think we began over time to understand the limitations of that route. And I think that has pretty interesting implications going forward.
So maybe, Kolya, you can speak to the question of his popularity in the Russian public. I understand that obviously, to even speak of terms like popularity or support in an authoritarian context like Russia doesn't necessarily make sense. But, what would you say was his sort of, first of all, has everybody in Russia heard of Navalny?
Well, I would say that sociological polls did show that at the peak of his popularity, Navalny was very well recognized, and well, he was supported by, say, 4 to 6% of respondents, which made him the person number 2 or number 3 after Vladimir Putin, equal to Gennady Zyuganov, who was already mentioned. And this is the miracle, because unlike other guys, he was a opposition politician, and his appearance in media was very much limited. And as you know, Putin was afraid even to name him by his name. All the time, Putin is and was saying the person, the patient, but he never, called Navalny Alexei Navalny. And last 3 years, when Navalny was put into the prison, his popularity was declining due to understandable reasons. He was still in touch with his team, with remainder of his team who went abroad and who are continuing the work. But it was more and more complicated. And that's why, the most recent sociological polls did show something like, say, 1 to 2% of Navalny's popularity. But anyway, even in prison, Navalny was able to lead the work of his headquarters. And as Graham and other participants did mention, Navalny was extremely creative. And his creativity was connected with the fact that he was able to feel and to find the nerve and to exploit it in order to get public attention, in order to be heard, and so on. So he did find these anti-corruption investigations, but now it's not that important at the time of the horrible war. Who cares whether Putin or somebody else around him did steal another $100 million? But the problem I see is in Navalny's first relative absence and now absolute absence, is that he was not able to change the work of his team in order to find a different nerve, in order to be heard, in order to be attractive. So they do still exploit those things which were found by Navalny several years ago.
Okay, so it doesn't, from what you're saying, it sounds like, at least if you believe the polls, which, that's a whole separate question. It doesn't sound like he was necessarily that much of a threat, at least immediate, for Putin. Given the fact that the elections are completely managed and not competitive, and that it's not completely clear that he would sort of win even a free and fair election in Russia. Maybe Brendan, you can speak. So why would Putin expend so much effort trying to suppress him? Or Gulnaz and Graham, you can also pipe in too.
Yeah, it's a good question, and answering that, I also want to kind of build on the point that Graham was making about the limits of anti-corruption as a mobilizing strategy. I think, one reason why Putin and many of the people in his inner circle were, with good reason, afraid of Navalny is that they probably also thought, and maybe still think, that corruption is this kind of weak point, or this point around which opposition could be mobilized, right? So that would be one reason. Another reason, as has been said, is his ability to speak to different, not only kind of different audiences, but also different ideological camps or factions within Russian opposition, and not just the politically active opposition, but the kind of, more engaged, critical part of Russian society. Again, he was one of the few, or that was certainly one of the opposition figures in Russia who was most successful at doing that, at kind of crossing ideological lines. But yeah, I just, something that Graham said kind of spoke to me, and that's that anti-corruption also has its limits as a mobilizing strategy. I mean, to get people to undertake risky, high-cost actions like protesting when there's a good chance that you'll be arrested or that you'll get fired from your job, you need to believe in something, and belief that everyone is corrupt or the whole system is corrupt, even when that's true, right, can be demobilizing as much as it can be mobilizing. So I think you're right, Graham, to point to the issue of corruption both as something that could be a very powerful, could be and has been both a very powerful mobilizing force, but also something that may not be the key issue, or at least not the only key issue, to get a broader sort of swath of the society into opposition, much less onto the streets. So maybe that's something we can talk further about, because I'm curious as to what others think on this issue as well.
So maybe I'll turn it back to you, Gulnaz. I mean, several of you have talking about his sort of cross-ideological appeal. I mean, do you agree with that? Can you give me more specific, kind of expand on that a bit, sort of, and also his regional appeal? I mean, apparently he was able to inspire activists in places like Tomsk and other places. So maybe you could sort of talk about.
Yeah, we didn't talk about his charisma, right? We spoke about his creativity, but he, I think, also represents a very new style of leader, who is very brazen and who embraces open politics, something that goes really against the nature of the system. Remember the code of Putinism, right? That builds on sort of more closed, control-based, avoiding conflict or hiding conflict, and he was really pushing forward a very new style of communication and engagement. And Russia was changing economically and socially quite dramatically in the first 10 years of 2000s, and he was there. That's why I was trying to suggest that he was a politician of that new generation. And so there were structural forces as well at play, and he represented those structural forces of modernization, of young generation, of young technologies, in a very creative, in a very open, direct manner. And I could see how that might very much threaten in terms of just understanding of what's the future and where the future is and where it is going. And that threat associated with Navalny, therefore, might not necessarily be seen as very rational, given that his recognition, etc. But again, Navalny was in a way changing, growing, and expanding. And the 2013, he got 28% in mayoral elections. And if we consider Moscow as very important, the most important city in Russia, and him getting that level of support could be seen as threatening. And in 2017-18, right, people were protesting. The March 2017 protests, he brought up thousands and thousands and hundreds of thousands in different cities in Russia. So if that moment would go further, we could see how these numbers will change quite dramatically. So he was going against the managed nature of the system, and was destabilizing it from the Kremlin's perspective. So that's where the threat was, I think, seen.
Great, Koya?
I'll try also to explain my view why Navalny posed a serious threat to the Kremlin, even now being absolutely isolated. In 2013, the Kremlin helped Navalny to be registered and to participate in Moscow mayoral elections. And at that time, it was important to, increase competition and to demonstrate that elections is a real thing in order to get higher legitimacy. Since 2014, after the annexation of Crimea, the situation did change in a very radical way, and Putin has switched from electoral legitimacy to military chieftains legitimacy. No more Putin needs elections to keep or to increase his legitimacy. He needs elections to go on, but the only reason to do this is just like at the time of the Soviet Union, to demonstrate that each and everybody is eager to confirm their loyalty to Putin. That's why the threat Navalny was posing to the system was changing and was increasing all the time. In 2018 presidential elections, Navalny wasn't even registered because his registration would mean that there would be legal criticism of Putin. And as Putin is no more, the winner in elections, but he is chieftain, he should not be criticized in any legal way. And these elections is very special due to the fact that nobody is really interested in figures, and we do know, almost know what figures will be announced. The problem is connected with agenda. So the problem is connected with a boy who can come to say...
With the what? I'm sorry, connected with the what? I missed that word.
With a small boy who can come to say that the king doesn't have any clothes. And this is extremely important. This is what has happened partly when we've seen those lines to give signature to support absolutely unknown candidate Boris Nadezhdin. So that's why the Kremlin was afraid of Navalny as a very creative person to be capable to offer something to demonstrate weakness of the Kremlin and to demonstrate that the overwhelming support the Kremlin is saying about all the time is not the real case. And you know, perhaps that Navalny did invent something. So in his view, everybody should come to vote on the first day, on March 17th at noon, to demonstrate the strength and the big number of those who are against the war and who are against the system.
Graham, so I mean, this is sort of, the Russian opposition is obviously in a pretty impossible situation, but where does it go from here? How do you kind of maintain relevance in a kind of context like Russia now?
Yeah, if I knew the answer to that, I wouldn't be sitting here. But I mean, I think it's really clear that the media is off limits. The online sphere is harder to communicate on as the Kremlin increasingly kind of closes down and offers alternatives and tries to replace YouTube, for example, with a safer alternative. Protests on the streets are not allowed. I think what's really dramatic, and I really agree with Kolya on the timing issue, that one of the kind of distressing, I think, and unmistakable signals from this murder last week, just before the elections comes up, is that Putin wants to pass the message that the regime is dedicated to not just the war in Ukraine, but a war on Russian liberalism at the same time. And the very fact that the war in Ukraine has taken so long has enabled them to pursue increasingly draconian measures against the opposition, to drive liberals underground and many more of them out of the country, to intimidate sort of lesser known people who have been connected in Navalny's network, which really was across the whole country. You alluded to this earlier on, but he did have supporters and activists all across the country, and really wiping that out, going forever. I think that's one of the regime's goals, and I think that's one of the very scary signals that was sent last Friday with this murder. So that leaves the opposition in a really marginalized position, the most marginalized position they've they've ever been in over the last 30 years. So what to do? Well, one of the things to do is to have somebody who has the charisma of Navalny, and obviously that's Yulia Navalnaya is the only person on the Russian political scene who could inherit his charisma and could bring it forward. And so I mean, she has, stepped up to that position. It's very clear that they had a game plan already worked out. Should Alexei be murdered? And she stepped up to that and has done an amazing job over the last week. I mean, if you just think for a second about all of the duties that she's undertaken over the last week and the context in which she's doing this, the personal context in which she's doing this, I think it speaks volumes about her character, her courage, and her clarity of mind. 3 things that she shared very much with Alexei. So I'm hopeful that we'll see more and more of her going forward. But how she's going to get leverage inside the country, I find I'm a bit of a loss really at that point. The example of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya in Belarus, I think is depressing. Someone who we were was on the tip of everyone's tongue and was this huge hero and now largely forgotten. I mean, this is Belarus, not Russia. Russia's got a broader prominence, but I think for the liberal opposition, things are extremely grim.
Yeah. So why do you think? I mean, it's interesting if you look at across places like China, where after 1989, a number of people went into exile and were just completely marginalized. And also Tikhanovskaya, obviously, who's in exile, and that sort of marginalizes them. I mean, is that why Navalny decided to come back? Because he felt like in exile he would just like completely lose any kind of relevance? I mean, maybe you can speak to that question, or Kolya, like why?
Yeah, I mean, I've been thinking about this for a little while, trying to think of comparative cases where an exiled opposition was able to overthrow a regime, and there are not a million examples, right? In fact, I can't really think of any. So there's often been an international push and an exile community push against regimes, but the regimes are ultimately only ever overthrown by domestic actions. And I think that's just hard to see any way around that, and it's hard to see how that happens at all in Russia right now. I mean, the one thing that we know is that we won't expect it, and when it does happen, it'll be a shock. But right now, it really would be a shock, right? There's really no signs of weakness domestic in the regime. And in fact, I've started to, when people ask me about the Russian opposition, now I've started to ask if they mean the nationalist far right mill blogger types, and is that the real opposition that Putin's actually worried about these days? Because I think they're much more of a live threat to Putin these days than the liberals, unfortunately.
Right. I mean, maybe Kolya, can you speak to sort of, or Gulnaz, or whoever wants to speak to the fact that he returned? I mean, it was obviously quite brave. I mean, given the fact that he had to have known.
Well, I think that this is very important question. Why exactly Navalny came back to the country where he was almost killed by the president? And I would say that, first of all, and it's Navalny's own explanation, is that there wasn't question for him whether to come back or to stay outside Russia. He felt like being Russian politician who should be in his country. And I would say that this, is part of explanation. But I think that it was pretty, Navalny himself is was very brave, but and also very ambitious politician. And it was understandable that staying outside of Russia, he would repeat the fate of many other prominent Russians who were playing active role in past, but who became well known, but not absolutely not influential due to their staying abroad. But I would remind you that not only Navalny came and it caused huge wave of protests when he was arrested immediately, but in a couple of weeks, this film appeared about Putin's palace, which has been watched by 130 million watchers, and which played very serious role. And taken together, I think this could work in a way it didn't work in reality, not to speak about the fact that if only Putin would not start the war in Ukraine, then Navalny, even being in prison, could be more safe than it appeared to be in reality.
Okay, I guess my next question has to do with sort of the impact of the West. I mean, we have two sides of this. One is sort of how, if there's anything more the West can do to pressure Russia, that's one side. So let's start with that question. I mean, Gulnaz, I mean, we've already sort of unprecedented sanctions against Russia. Is there much the West can do? Anything more? I mean, or are we just sort of, you know, or anything at all, or is basically not?
Yeah, no, I think the symbolic sanctions against individuals who were, you know, in that camping sites and jails and stuff are, you know, they're symbolic, right? But on the real sort of strategic plane, of course, it's helping Ukraine is something that's where the war fronts are, and that's where the lines of Russia's future lie. And to the extent that the West, you know, I think the West got the message a long time ago, but such events that shock the public, you know, and individuals and leaders, I think they become sort of a point of an impulse that might give an additional dedication and commitment and additional energy for the cause of defending Ukraine and defeating Russia in Ukraine. So that seems to be the main pathway.
Yeah, right. Makes sense. Absolutely. But I guess the other, so one element of the Western reaction is those opposed to Putin and trying to pressure Putin. But of course, sadly, Putin has many allies in the West, including Tucker Carlson. So I'm wondering if his killing makes it harder to for people meet Tucker Carlson after giving this very very kind of quite such an easy interview with Putin that even Putin complained about the absence of challenging questions, which is quite remarkable. And I noticed that Tucker Carlson actually did condemn the killing of Navalny. And so I'm wondering whether it kind of does anything to make it harder for the right in the United States to kind of openly support Putin, or do you think it doesn't make much of a difference? Maybe we'll go with you, Graham, or Brendan, or whatever.
I think what we learned from Tucker Carlson condemning Putin for the murder of Navalny was that Carlson's check had cleared for the interviews with Putin, and so you know it was safe to make those comments. I mean, I've spent the last year trying to work on shoring up support amongst Republicans for Ukraine, and during that time, I've spoken to lots of Republicans around the beautiful state of North Carolina, where Republicans are pretty easy to meet. And what I've discovered is that there are two communities there. One is the kind of traditional Republicans who are often related to the military, which is huge in the state, and who are 100% on board with support for Ukraine, and who are resolutely opposed to Putin. And then the rest is, and I'm not telling you anything you don't know, right? But the rest are these MAGA types, for whom reality is an inconvenience. And like, there's literally nothing you can say that will make them, turn from the excuse of the day for not supporting Ukraine. Now it's about the border. A year ago, when I started trying this, it wasn't about the border. It was about, Putin's a good guy. And so it just kind of evolves what the reasons are for not facing up to the reality on the ground. And so I'm very skeptical that this makes any difference, that any facts on the ground. The one thing that Trump ever said that was true was that I could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue tomorrow and they'd still support me. And that we've just seen that demonstrated over and over and over again. And so unfortunately, I don't expect this to make much of a difference either in the House of Representatives. I think one of the things that we underestimate is the extent to which the Russians have actually bought off key parts of the US elite, one way or another. I don't have proof on this, and one day we'll find out. But I suspect that a lot of these people have not such distant ties financially, and Trump for sure, to the Russian regime, and that just makes it very, very difficult for these kind of ethical or morally based campaigns to get any traction.
So, I mean, sort of speaking to that, I mean, obviously, I think, one of the most stunning transformations has been the Republican Party in regards to Russia. I mean, I think, we're all of us, at least Graham and Nikolai, are old enough to remember the 1980s when we'd have been quite shocked to learn that the Republican Party was becoming Russophilic in the 21st century. I mean, how much do you think of the Russophilia is sort of Trump as a person versus does it have a kind of broader base in the Republican Party? So if Trump dies tomorrow, would you expect a shift in or a significant shift in the Republican attitude towards Putin?
Can I mean,
yes, please.
He's certainly the catalyst, or a big part of the catalyst, but not to be too blunt about it, but this is the future that a large part of the US right wants, where they can kill their political opponents at will. So I'm not particularly optimistic that even if Trump were to suddenly disappear from the scene, we would see a dramatic change among the leading elements of the Republican Party in the US.
Graham, do you agree with that?
I was just laughing because usually the question that people ask types like us is, what happens if Putin dies tomorrow? And what I always say is, he'll be replaced by somebody worse. And I think I think the answer with Trump, it's not excluded that he too could be replaced by somebody worse, because there's this whole ecosystem of far-right think tanks and think tanks that didn't used to be that far right, but now have really gone off the deep end, that has created an environment that is supportive of another Trump afterwards. And then if you look around the world, they're everywhere. It's not just in the United States. Italy, potentially France. All these far right leaders are appearing all over the world, in the long-standing democracies, in ways that I think, unfortunately, this is the future. It's not going to change.
Gulnaz?
I don't know, Graham, should we call them think tanks or junk tanks? I just learned this name in Athens. Someone was talking about an ecosystem of junk tanks in Europe. So just precisely on the same point, that there is a material sort of basis to these ideas and to this polarization. And so it's not just personalities, but there are groups and institutions that follow these ideas, and there is money that supports it too, which makes it extremely pessimistic. But can I actually look and use, while I'm here, we didn't talk about, and I mentioned that Ukraine as the main ground, but something that really also came to the surface is the fate of other political oppositioners who are in jail now. And I was thinking about it, but what can the West do to pressure, to save Kara-Murza, Yashin, many others who are, and there are hundreds and hundreds and thousands in the jails, right? And each one of them is talented, creative, and a big asset. And of course, we pay attention more to those that we know more. But I don't know, have you all seen how can the government's pressure if Gershkovich is still there, right? But how can governments in the West pressure the release of political prisoners, given that there is this event?
So Gershkovich, of course, is the Wall Street journalist, Wall Street Journal reporter who's in prison. Yeah. So you're supposed to be the expert. So is there anything we can do? I guess, or no? Is that the answer?
Public attention, right? Public attention
Public
to
attention,
to
yeah.
these issues, right? The constant public attention.
So I would actually be remiss. I think we all appreciate Navalny's bravery and the fact that he's been able to, his very active opposition to the war, and his insane kind of bravery in the face of challenges. But I do want to sort of, raise the fact that, we have a very active Ukraine center here in Toronto, and I have to say, attitude towards Navalny is quite ambivalent, to put it mildly, largely in reaction to sort of Navalny's past nationalism. Maybe I'll start with you, Graham. Can you kind of speak to a little bit of that? So how do we understand? At one level, we sort of see Navalny as this sort of incredibly brave sort of opponent of authoritarianism, and in support of democracy and the like. But I think others in Georgia and Ukraine sort of see him quite differently. Can you kind of speak to that?
Yeah, so Navalny got his start in Yabloko, which is was a kind of opposition party that was really had a lot of different churches within it, and there was a liberal flank and there was a more nationalistic flank, and he was very much in that more nationalistic flank, and he ended up being expelled for basically being an extremist nationalist. And he tried to speak that language. He tried to reach out to participated in neo-Nazi marches in Russia, the Ruski March, back in the early 2000s. And so hung out with some pretty unsavory characters. And I think, the way I've thought about that over time, and I think Gulnaz talked about learning. And I think this is what she was referring to, at least in part, was Navalny learned that was crude and unacceptable kind of language that he was using, and that if he wanted to be a serious politician with international credibility, he needed to switch. But he also understood that if he wanted serious credibility within Russia, every poll that we do, 60 to 70% of Russians highly strongly identify with the Russian state, and have pretty strong nationalist perspectives, not necessarily ethnic nationalist, but very strong nationalist perspective. Gulnaz has written beautifully about this in her book, but there's a lot of evidence on this, and so he's faced with this dilemma where he learns that these attitudes are going to alienate a liberal audience, but not addressing nationalism is going to alienate the Russian audience. And he was trying very hard. I think this is where the language of this beautiful Russia of the future, he wants to carry the flag, because he knows without carrying a flag, you're not going to win. But he wants to carry the flag in it for a more beautiful country. And I think he made that transition, I think, really well. And to be fixated on his youthful mistakes is an error, and misses the real meaning of the man, I think.
Well, Naz, do you want to speak to that?
Yes, but I do want to bring up something, right? And that's the issue of with the war that was put on the table, is the issue of Russian imperialism, but also ethnic hierarchies that have been very much invisible, very much unrecognized, and are still very much unrecognized. And the other limit of Navalny's sort of ideas is that his focus on corruption wasn't also, say, complemented by the focus about inequalities, for example, in Russia, right? And very much intersecting inequalities, which are regional and ethnic. And if we were to think about the other people who would come in the future to carry that flag for Russia's future, one topic, one big debate and discussion that needs to be added into that political landscape is the discussion of these ethnic, regional sort of diversity issues in Russia, and where does Russian nationalism stands with regards to that, and can the dominant Russian group accept that there is this invisible issue. And sociologists, cultural theories are writing about racism, and it's hard even in the Russian realm to bring up the issue of racism. It's not heard, it doesn't resonate. A few weeks ago there was a interesting exchange between Ekaterina Shulman and Yulia Latynina on decolonization studies, where a very clear blind spot emerged with them focusing on decolonization and leftist discourse and the woke culture in the West, and how it works to bring out the right, far-right supporters and far-right votes, while the youth that follows woke culture doesn't go to vote. And so they were thinking in terms of just Western issues, but they were not at all asking. It's a complete blind spot, and it will have to. Mikhail Zygar started writing about it, and so that big issue that was absent on the agenda is something that I'm sure it will take some time, and but it will have to be added.
Kolya, do you want to speak to this, or?
I would say that all of us are experts, not politicians, and we do have a privilege to say what we do think without having in mind whether it's shared or supported by majority of our listeners, not to speak about population. Navalny was a politician, and a politician of populist type, which means that you never know about real views of populist politician until he comes to power, because when coming to power, he's trying to use slogans which are supported by majority of his or her potential supporters. So I do have 3 points about Navalny's so-called nationalism. First is connected with the fact that, like any other human being, Navalny could make mistakes, and he did make mistakes. And the one he did was in 2008, when Russia did invade Georgia, and he made rash critical comments. He did later explain what was the reason for this and so on, and he did apologize several times. In 2014, he made his well-known statement about the fact that Crimea is not is not a sandwich to be easily returned, and that's why the attitude of Ukrainians toward Navalny is very complicated, as Lukandit mildly put it. But I would say that, first of all, it would be stupid for any politician at a time when 90% of Russians did support annexation of Crimea. At that time, it was seen as absolutely peaceful restoration of a kind of historic justice, to claim something against this. You could do this being an expert, but you could not do this if you would like to make your political career. But my second point is that Navalny was absolutely right, and he did explain this later when saying that at first it was horrible mistake and violation of many different laws made by Putin, but then it should be not decided between Moscow and Kyiv. It should be decided by inhabitants of Crimea. And there should be a kind of referendum to understand what exactly will happen next. And I do think that now, when almost a decade has passed, the understanding that there is no other way out except for the one explained that time by Navalny is becoming more and more common wisdom.
Well, I think many would actually disagree. I mean, I think that if we started holding referendums in every contested territory, so that would create a lot of chaos in the world. And also you'd have to like return Ukraine to the demographics of 2014. So I'm not sure that that is at all a consensus view. You know, we don't think we want sort of to start having referendums in every contested territory in the world. That really kind of is a recipe for instability, but that's just my opinion. Okay, so I mean, I think that Graham, you made an interesting point, which is that I mean, I sort of feel like the Russian opposition is sort of has entered the kind of dissident stage. It feels very dissident-y, in the sense of, you know, being completely marginalized and sort of, you know, it's more about sort of speaking truth to power than actually gaining power, but actually gaining power. And I feel like part of the dilemma that you noted is the fact that the Russian opposition necessarily has kind of two audiences. One is the West, which has its own set of values. I mean, because it needs West support for, you know, pressure and sometimes money, but it also obviously has the Russian domestic public, which is, you know, can be quite different. So that's obviously kind of not an easy needle to thread. Is that sort of what you're saying? Okay.
Yeah, basically, and the more one excavates support for the war, the more I kind of realize that it's getting it the wrong way around to criticize Russian oppositionists for not having more supporters. It's the supporters that are the problem, not the strategists. And the strategies that are available are you know, they're pretty unattractive for a democratic liberal opposition. I mean, if you just think about it for 2 seconds, Putin dies tomorrow. All of a sudden, they're not prepared for it, and so more or less, you know, this is all a fantastic scenario, but more or less, free and fair elections end up getting held for the presidency. You think about the different routes, the different kinds of campaigns that could be run. You're running a campaign that says, "Oh, I'm sorry that we invaded Ukraine. We're going to give them back territory. You know, that was a mistake. We should also clamp down on corruption and become a democracy." That, I mean, how far is that going to get you? Like, really, not very. Is my fear. The alternatives to say, you know, we didn't do enough in Ukraine. We're surrounded. We're, you know, still the besieged fortress. And we need to be tougher. That's the winning hand here. And I just think, like, you know, Kolya is completely right. There's a difference between, you know, kind of an ethical position that an expert can take and a politically attractive position that a politician can take. And that's just a really, really hard place to be. And Russia has never faced up to its history. It's never faced up to the truth. Countries don't like facing up to truth. Russia is not, by any stretch of the imagination, the only place that has an unpleasant history that hasn't faced up to. The United States, Great Britain, France, you know, the list could go on, right? But it's particularly damaging in this case. And I think, you know, the ballot box route in Russia doesn't lead anywhere much better these days. You know, I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but that's certainly what my gut and what my surveys suggest.
Okay. So I think we'll wrap it up there on that optimistic note. Does anybody else have something they want to sort of, any final thoughts? Anyways, thank you so much, Gulnaz, Brendan, Nikolai, and Graham. That was a very, you know, sobering and kind of fruitful discussion. So thank you so much, and so long.